Hey guys, so in this video what I'm going to do is go over some of the tips that I would recommend for anyone that is thinking about taking the burp exam. I took the burp exam in 2022 and I passed in December. I took the exam thinking it would be an easy breeze and a nice certification to get. It certainly was a nice certification. I was quite happy once I got it, but I unanticipated both the effort it would have taken to actually get to this point, as well as the fact that I was somewhat misguided for the most part of the journey. So these 10 tips are really to identify the pain points I've experienced in the hope that you don't go down the same path, and I hope that you enjoy them. So tip number 1 is quite an easy one, is to actually take and learn the labs from Portsmouth. These labs provide a comprehensive view of the vulnerabilities that you'll find within the exam. Furthermore, these labs are actually free. So this for me was a good starting point, and I would obviously highly recommend any individual taking the exam to start with these labs. These labs actually provide a good understanding on the types of vulnerabilities and how to identify the vulnerabilities within a web application. One pain point, however, which I'll get to in a little bit of time, is that it doesn't necessarily provide you the ability to exploit the vulnerabilities, which sounds a little silly, but they certainly provide you the ability to run certain alerts, or at least identify and function with those vulnerabilities themselves. One thing that you'll need to learn on your own accord is, once they're identified, once you're able to at least operate with the vulnerability, how do you actually then use them to gain low-level or high-privilege accounts, or furthermore, try and get the user contents or the file contents on the actual server itself. Tip number 2 is to prepare your payloads. I would probably emphasize this out of all the 10 tips, that this is the most fundamental, which in hindsight it was very naive for myself to believe that, which I did. I went into the exam, the first 2 exams, and thought that I had enough knowledge on the types of vulnerabilities and how to identify them, and I can do a quick search on Google, get the exploit or the payload associated with the vulnerability, and then bosh, I'm on to the next stage. It's clearly not as simple as that. The last thing that you want to do when going in the exam and not having the preparation of particular payloads, and what I mean by payloads are certain syntaxes are able to then be used to then exploit that user account or the file contents. So those payloads need to be predefined, and they can be reused, they can be polished and rejigged based on the scenarios, and you will get the exam that differs. So those payloads can be manipulated in some form, but the emphasis is that get them prepared. The last thing you want to do is going into the exam, going onto Google, going onto websites that are just clickbaits of just complete nonsense. It's so frustrating. Be prepared to understand and to perform exploitable payloads in order to reach that stage. So tip number 3 is to be prepared to fail first time. I know that this is quite a pessimistic tip, but from my experience firsthand, as well as looking at other people's blogs, no one's really boasting that they pass first time. I get the sense that quite intelligent individuals with possibly a lot more knowledge than myself within this area are failing multiple times, and there is a correlation there. And that could be for many reasons, but I think the reason why people pass is because they get a good understanding of what the expectations are of this particular exam, not necessarily because they lack knowledge or understanding. So prepared to take the exam, go in with the understanding that you have a learning curve, but give it a good go, give it your best efforts, but don't be defeated if you fail, or at least don't find any exploits. There are exam attempts that I took place that I just let's be honest, I didn't get any exploits and I quit halfway through. This is quite an exhausting journey, and I would highly recommend you have the mindset that you may fail the first time. If you pass first time, fantastic, great to hear. Chances are you're going to fail, and you may fail multiple times, but that's okay. As long as you pass, that's all that counts. Tip number 4 is to understand the rabbit hole scenario. So I don't quite like the terminology of rabbit holes. I know a lot of people have used it. Rabbit holes and time sinks, those two scenarios have been used quite often in other people's experiences. My terminology for this is that the exam can be quite tricky and be quite catchy in scenarios where you believe that there is a vulnerability, but there isn't. Meaning that there isn't an exploitable vulnerability. You may use burp and it'll identify there are vulnerabilities, and there might be a possibility it can be exploited, but there may be scenarios where it cannot. But furthermore, one vulnerability does not necessarily mean it can be exploited. It has to be, in certain scenarios, coupled with multiple vulnerabilities in order to be exploited. So things like web caching and sending HTTP requests is coupled with that, or using the user sessions at the same time. All these scenarios, it's not just a one vulnerability, one payload, one exploit, one-to-one relationship. There could be many to one, many different scenarios, many different payloads. Take the exam, give it a go, but you will start to find that there are certain scenarios like this. Take into account as well, it is 4 hours long. Portswigger actually extended the time frame from 3 hours to 4 hours in recent times. 4 hours in itself to find 6 exploits, and when I passed as well, I had enough time in the clock. I don't think time is a factor. I think, however, learning how the exam works, learning these particular little gotchas, can be a lot of time-saving initiatives. Obviously, having the payloads is obviously a big critical aspect of that. But you have enough time. Tip number 5 would be to learn from your mistakes. As you can probably hear in the background, I have my little dog. He's complaining. He's complaining possibly about nothing. And I took the 5th exam and I gave up. I gave up because he needed to go for a walk. As I'm actually recording this as well, you can probably hear my dog in the background. This is the same scenario that I had in exam number 5. Is I had to I had to essentially quit the exam because I needed to take that little guy out for a walk. So I was thinking to myself, well, exam number 5 is $99. It's basically a $99 dog walk. Not ideal, and again, trying to make a recording in the same scenario. These things happen, but it's trying to avoid certain scenarios, particularly if you're trying to concentrate. Give him a little bit of food, keep him happy. Tip number 6 is to perform the practice exam. This is going to be the nearest you're going to get to the actual exam itself, by far. Portswigger actually provides you not only types of vulnerabilities that could be part of the exam, that's not really the important part of this. The practice exam actually allows you to grasp an understanding on how to traverse between the different stages. How to get from stage 1 by the low privilege, stage 2 with the admin account, and then finally stage 3 getting the file contents. Tip number 7 is to understand that there is only one active user. Portswigger actually make it clear on the exam directions that each application has up to one active user who will be logged in either as the user or the administrator. So we know on these scenarios that stage 1 is for the low privilege, stage 2 is for the admin side. So we know what type of vulnerabilities will be part of this exam. A gentleman called Mika has a website that I credit and other individuals have credit as well. A matrix that provides a summary of the types of categories that could be part of each particular stage. I found this very useful. A lot of people have also referenced this. This is highly recommended. I'll put this in the link below. One thing, however, is that he didn't go one step further and exclude particular vulnerabilities based on the outcome of that particular stage. So for instance, if you're able to find a web cache poisoning in stage 1, meaning that there is an active user, then you can probably then eliminate some particular vulnerabilities in stage 2, meaning that there isn't going to be an active account, therefore you don't need to then focus on those types of vulnerabilities, or at least try and identify them. Also, on the flip side, if you're able to identify that there is a brute force attack, for instance, in stage 1, you haven't actually used the active account, the low privilege active session, in stage 1, which means there is a probable chance that the active account is actually the administrator, which means it would be suggested that you could focus on the more user account vulnerabilities or active session vulnerabilities as part of stage 2. Not to say that you can exclude the others, but I would obviously recommend that approach by looking at them first. Tip number 8, stage 3 is much harder. I found myself struggling, not necessarily on stage 1 and 2, but number 3 I believe is exponentially more difficult. After reading some individuals' blogs, they obviously concur with that statement as well. My thoughts post certification, and if I was to advocate for individuals, I would spend less time focusing on stage 1 and 2 and start focusing more on the technicalities on stage 3. The vulnerabilities are very different, as you can see in Maker's blog. So I support the fact that because they are different vulnerabilities, you can make that distinction, but I would certainly state that stage 3 is more difficult, requires a bit more time. It's probably where people fail the most as well. So yes, I would focus heavily on stage 3 as opposed to stage 1 and 2. Tip number 9, one exploitable vulnerability per stage. 3 stages, you need to find an exploitable vulnerability on each of those stages. To my understanding, and I believe I read it somewhere and I tried to get a reference but I couldn't, is that there is only one exploitable vulnerability in order to get that phase. You will find there are a few vulnerabilities, but as people will suggest, there are these quote-unquote rabbit holes that make these vulnerabilities unexploitable. Furthermore, even though a vulnerability is not necessarily exploitable, it may be exploitable coupled with another vulnerability. So you need to take into account that it's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship of vulnerabilities, payloads, exploits. You need to have the idea that, well, you could have one active session, you can have a HTTP request or a caching that needs to be then cached with content lamps or other aspects. You have to have this scenario of having multiple vulnerabilities based on the scenarios of the environment. So not multiple vulnerabilities has the same exploit payload. You're going to have multiple payload, or at least derived payloads for multiple scenarios. There are a lot of cases. It's not as simple as a one-to-one relationship. That's my point. Tip number 10, take one lab at a time. I tried to get fancy. Exam number 3, I think, I took one exploit. Did not work. It got very complex. Both were running at the same time. I had these autonomous scripts looking at both labs. I thought that by its very nature that can be autonomous. It's not the case. You have enough time. It's 4 hours long. I would focus on one lab. If you get stuck, stop, go to the other lab, refresh your mindset, make progress on there. If you don't, go back to the other. Don't try and get fancy working at both at the same time. It can get quite complex. And so there are my tips. There are my 10 tips. I was quite grateful I passed. I did not anticipate it would take me this long to pass. I hope it doesn't take you the same. I hope this information I provided is worthwhile. Love to hear if it is or if it is not. Certainly leave the comments below. Guys, good luck. Hope to hear you soon. Thank you for watching.